Have you ever seen a person come from nothing and become a millionaire? This is the true story of a man who was not lazy, set a goal for himself, and became a millionaire. The story begins in San Francisco in 1981. Unsuccessful salesman Chris Gardner lives with his wife and young son. Chris sells a medical device called Portable Bone Density Scanner. Chris wakes up his son Christopher to take him to daycare and goes in search of clients. He is waiting for a bus and is approached by a homeless man who thinks Chris has a time machine.
It's a time machine, isn't it? Seems like a time machine.
But Chris tries to ignore him and go about his work. The business plan is not successful. Doctors refuse to buy the device because of its high price.
Just don't need it, Chris. It's unnecessary and expensive.
Chris has to find other clients and asks his wife Linda to pick up his son. As a result, the couple begins to argue. Linda reminds her husband of the letters from the tax office and asks him to solve the problem. Chris's car is towed away by a tow truck and he has to walk or take the bus to get around, but it all turns out to be in vain. No one wants to buy a strange device. At dinner, Linda asks her husband again to find a job. She admits that she's tired of working alone and that her patience is wearing thin. As Chris listens to his wife's complaints, a Rubik's Cube catches his attention. He spends the entire evening trying to put it together.
For this budget year, that ends September 30th.
The next day, everything repeats itself. But as Chris walks down the main street, a brightly colored, expensive car catches his eye. He asks the owner where he got the money to buy such a car.
What do you do and how do you do it?
Guy says he works as a stockbroker. At this moment, Chris Gardner has a new dream. Chris spends the night thinking about his future, and in the morning, he tells Linda that he wants to be a broker.
What job?
Stockbroker.
But the wife no longer has faith in her husband. She insists it's time for him to do something real. Despite Linda's words, Chris shows up at the brokerage house. But he doesn't want to look foolish, so he asks a hippie street singer to look after his device.
Do you mind if I leave this here with you? I'll give you more money when I come back out.
The man goes to the office and gets an application form for an internship. But Chris does not manage to pass the interview. He sees the singer trying to escape with his device. Chris gives chase, but the girl turns out to be very fast. Hippie goes down to the subway and gets away. A distraught Chris returns home. On the way, he studies the form he was given. It says that 20 interns will be recruited for the course, and only one will get a job in a big company. The man cannot sleep again. He is sure that without an education, he will not have a chance to get a job. In the morning, Chris takes his son to daycare as usual. His son tells him that the kids are watching TV all day instead of learning. Chris tries to talk to the owner about it, but she reminds him of the payment debt and offers to take the boy home. They had an unpleasant talk. Later, Chris takes the form to the office. Chris hopes to be interviewed by the head of HR himself, but Jay Twistle doesn't give the candidate much time. He takes the form and promises to call back. Chris makes an appointment with a doctor who might be able to buy the device. But on his way to the doctor's office, he notices the singer and the stolen device. The man gives chase again. He remembers spending all of his money on unusual equipment. Chris was confident he could sell a few dozen units quickly, but it's been over a year and he still can't find anyone to buy them. Gardner catches up with the thief on the bus and takes his equipment back. Then he goes to the daycare center, and Christopher is surprised to see his father holding two devices. That means he didn't make any money again. The next day, Chris and Linda wish little Christopher a happy birthday. The parents give the boy a basketball that Linda bought with her salary. At the end of the evening, the wife can't take it anymore. She rudely answers her husband's questions and admits that she is tired of waiting. Linda no longer believes that Chris will ever start earning.
So you don't trust me now?
I don't care.
But Chris continues to believe in his dream. He waits outside Mr. Twistle's office and asks to talk to him while they ride in a cab. Twistle spins a Rubik's Cube in his hands and does not listen to Chris. Then Chris takes the toy from the broker and folds it to show how smart and talented he is. Twistle admires Chris's skills, but promises him nothing. He gets out of the car and leaves the man alone. Chris realizes he has to pay for the cab. His wallet turns out to be empty, and he flees. A man goes down to the subway, just like the thief singer did recently. But Chris has no luck. He fails to get the device into the car, and the scanner falls onto the platform. A man calls home to apologize to his wife. Chris says he will be back soon, but Linda tells her husband that she is leaving him. Chris runs home, but it turns out to be too late. There is no Linda, Christopher, or their stuff in the apartment. As Chris runs around the apartment, the phone rings in the room. The man picks it up and hears Twistle's voice. He offers him a job interview. Twistle asks him to write down the number, but Chris doesn't have a pen handy. Chris runs out of the apartment and goes to the store to write down the number. He runs into Wayne, who owes him $14, but the old man won't pay him back. The man thinks about his family all night, and in the morning, he waits for Linda outside her work. Chris doesn't persuade his wife to come back, but he demands that she give him his son.
Christopher's staying with me.
Well, I'm just not happy.
Then go get happy, Linda. But Christopher's living with me. Christopher's living with me.
And to make sure no one can trick him, Chris picks up the boy from daycare. Chris and his son sit down to dinner. Just then, there is a knock at the door. On the doorstep is the renter, who reminds the family that they haven't paid rent in months. Chris manages to convince the old man not to kick them out for a few more days. In return, he promises to repaint the walls and leave the place clean. In the morning, Christopher goes to daycare, and Chris keeps his promise and paints the walls. But there's another knock on his door, and this time it's much more serious. The police take Chris to the station and charge him with tax evasion. The man is locked in a cell and promised that he will not be released until the morning after confirmation of payment. Chris has to call his wife and ask her to pick up Christopher. He asks for her help, but demands that Linda return their son to him. Chris is released, and there are only 15 minutes left for the interview for the broker position. He doesn't have time to change, and runs into the office looking terrible. He is wearing work clothes and has paint all over his face. This makes Chris very nervous, but he doesn't run away. He goes into the conference room and is honest about why he came without a suit. Martin Frome, the director of the company, is surprised at the sight of the strange man, but gives him a chance to speak. He asks the candidate questions, which Chris answers easily. After interview, Twistle tells him that he's been invited to be an intern. To the HR manager's surprise, Chris says he'll think about the offer. He admits that he wasn't prepared for the fact that he would be working for 6 months without a salary, and of all the interns, only one would become a bank broker. Chris comes home and finishes painting the walls. He looks at his watch and runs outside. Chris waits for Linda to bring her son home from daycare, but the woman is very late. Finally, Linda brings in Christopher, who has fallen asleep in her arms. She puts the boy to bed and tells her husband that she is leaving for New York. Linda asks to keep the child, but Chris doesn't agree, and the woman says goodbye to her son forever. In the evening, Chris calls the secretary Twistle and tells him that he's accepted the internship. While Christopher sleeps, the man packs his bags. In the morning, a buddy takes the family to a cheap motel. From that day on, Chris and Christopher Jr. have a new life. To support his son, Chris suggests that he play basketball. Several times the ball flies past the ring, and his father suggests that Christopher give up his dream. As Christopher sadly puts the ball away, Chris realizes his mistake. He tells his son not to listen to people who don't believe in him, even if that person is your father, and he must always believe in his own strength and push forward. After the game, the two go around town again looking for buyers for the device. This time Chris is lucky. He sells a device and gets $250. In the morning, Chris goes to his internship for the first time. Candidates are tasked with calling potential clients and offering them the company's services. During the first break, Chris runs out and meets Mr. Frome. The men manage to talk for a while. Then Gardner spots a homeless man with his device on the other side of the street and rushes after him. In his panic, Chris doesn't notice that a car is about to hit him. The man doesn't want to lose his job, so he refuses any medical help and returns to the office without a shoe. Christopher notices that his father has lost a shoe, but the man manages to wrap the story in a joke and keep things quiet. At the office, he not only has to work, but also serves coffee. Chris doesn't like it, but he patiently runs every errand, hoping to become a better intern. In the evenings, he picks up his son from daycare and takes him to the motel, but there, he is again reminded of his debt. Chris develops a personal strategy. He doesn't drink water at work, so he doesn't waste time on the toilet. He doesn't hang up the phone and tries to call as many people as possible. One day, Chris manages to get a meeting with Walter Ribbon. He doesn't want to waste any time and hurries to the client's office, but the boss asks him to take the car to the parking lot, and the guy has to change his plans. Secretly from his boss, Chris decides to combine tasks. He goes to meet Ribbon in someone else's car, but the idea turns out to be stupid. Because of traffic jams, the man has to leave the car in the middle of the street. Despite the difficulties, Chris makes it to the office on time, but the secretary tells him that Mr. Ribbon has already left. The frustrated man goes back to his boss's car and finds a receipt for a parking ticket on it. The last of the money goes to pay the fine. Chris tells his son that they will have to spend the weekend trying to find a new buyer for the device. On the way, Chris decides to visit Mr. Ribbon in person to convince him to become a client of the company. Chris pretends to be nearby and manages to win over the businessman. Ribbon invites Chris and Christopher to a football match as a thank you for his attention. This turns out to be a great opportunity for Chris to meet other potential clients. Despite Chris's best efforts, Ribbon admits that he can't trust his assets to a rookie. After that, the guy realizes he needs to study even more. In 4 months, Chris sells all the devices and the money should be enough for the rest of the internship. But a letter from the bank destroys his optimism. For non-payment of taxes, the court is seizing his accounts, leaving him with only a few dollars in his pocket. Chris again reminds Wayne of the debt, but his friend again refuses to give up $14. He says he paid off his debt when he helped him move into a motel. Chris again notices a homeless man in the park. A man takes his device back to sell and make a few $100s. He finds a doctor who is interested in a portable x-ray, but the device turns out to be broken and Chris leaves with nothing. That same evening, Chris is dealt another blow. They are kicked out of the motel for non-payment. The man has to calm his son down and find a place for them to spend the night. His old buddy Wayne won't let his friend in.
Wayne!
Man goes to the train station, and he has to distract Christopher with stories about the time machine. Chris and Christopher have to spend the night in a public restroom right on the floor. This time, Man's nerves fail him and he can't hold back his tears. Chris goes to his internship in the morning. After the work, he looks for a place to stay at a homeless shelter. At one shelter, he is turned away, but at another, the man makes sure he and his son can spend the night. Man puts his son to bed and repairs the device. In the morning, Chris leaves the lodge and heads to work with his stuff. Now he has to leave early to pick up his son and get a spot in the waiting line at the shelter. According to the rules of the shelter, Chris has to attend a church service, but after the service, he rushes to dinner so he can study for his exam. The cherished day comes. Chris submits his work second, but he still has hope of winning, because his opponent hasn't solved the problem on the back. As Chris goes outside, he is called by Mr. Frome. The boss asks the man for $5 for a cab. Chris gives him the last bill from his wallet. This time there's not enough room at the shelter. Chris has to take his son on the subway all night. In the morning, he becomes a donor for money, but it's only enough to buy a new part for the broken device. The next night, the family gets a place in the shelter again. Chris does not sleep and repairs the device. The next day, Chris sells it to the old doctor and gets his $250. For the first time in many days, the family sleeps in a hotel, and Chris manages to get some sleep. Chris takes his son to the ocean to rest a bit and decide what to do next. A few more days pass waiting for the result, and finally Chris is invited to Frome's office. Chris learns that he has been hired and will be paid a decent salary from that day forward. Boss gives Chris back his $5, along with which he gets hope. 6 years later, Chris Gardner organized his own investment fund. After a few more years, he sold his shares and became a millionaire.